Hello, and thank you for watching. I'm Heidi Cloutier, one of the trainers with the Northeast Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports Network. Today, we'll be discussing how to develop a continuum for responding to concerning behavior with a focus on developing a behavior flowchart to ensure consistent responses in your school. The content for this module was supported by the Northeast Positive Behavior Network. This is part 2 of a 3-part virtual asynchronous training on developing a continuum of responses to behavior errors. In part 1, we explored the importance of clearly defining behaviors in order to identify consistent responses. Look for part 3 on developing referral forms to ensure consistent management and tracking of behaviors. This content will walk your team through the importance of having a behavior flowchart and how to set this up. Your team will be tasked with developing a discipline ladder or flowchart, which differentiates between major and minor behaviors. Please be sure to submit these documents in Canvas so you can get feedback from your trainers, and work with your team to determine how you'll get input from stakeholders and how you'll train staff to ensure consistent responses. You'll remember from part 1 in this series that there are 3 important components of organizing building and district responses to addressing behavior. We start by having clearly defined behavior definitions, which we explored in part 1 of the asynchronous training videos. Explicit definitions of wanted and unwanted behavior provide clarity to both students and staff and is a critical component of identifying clear procedures for staff to respond to inappropriate behavior objectively. Then we develop a flowchart so everyone knows the difference between staff versus office managed behavior. Your team should work with school staff to develop categories for behavior that include staff managed, office managed, and situationally inappropriate behaviors to develop the flowchart. It's important for teams to actively seek consensus across staff with responses to problem behavior by revisiting and practicing the procedures, at least annually or as your data indicate a need. And the last piece, which we talk about in part 3 of this series, entails developing a behavior referral form that will help ensure a consistent process for gathering data and monitoring behaviors. We encourage teams to review existing discipline policies to ensure that inclusionary practices are used whenever possible, and that exclusionary practices are used with discretion for safety purposes only, and always with an instructional component with a focus on restoring relationships. Look for more about this again in part 3. The behavior flow chart helps ensure that all staff are knowledgeable on what responses are appropriate and what the process should look like when responding to rule violating behaviors. This flow chart outlines responses linked to various levels of behavior and a process for both classroom and office managed behavior that's clear to staff and students. Having a clearly outlined process for responding to behavior helps clear up any confusion and fosters more consistency of staff in responding to rule violations. Make sure to get feedback from stakeholders again before implementing. Let's take a look at some examples. In this example, you'll see this school has used their behavior definitions to organize behavior into a behavior ladder arranged from low to high severity of behaviors and consequences based on how the behavior affects the environment and others. You'll note that as you move across the screen from left to right, you have low-level behaviors matched with low consequences. And that many of these level 1 and level 2 behaviors would be classified in their minor definitions for behavior under defiance or disruption. As you move to level 3 and 4, the intensity of these behaviors increases, as do the consequences. This example has some great proactive strategies to encourage expected behaviors and walks you through examples of how we can support or address behavior and when additional support is warranted. This high school behavior procedure flowchart, again, walks staff through specific strategies to try and explicitly identifies when and who to request support from. There are specific behaviors that are identified as staff and administrator managed, and even prompts to check in with an adjustment counselor if the teacher feels there are gray areas. The last column identifies the action administration will take so that staff making a referral will understand the steps involved. In this example, it includes conversations for success, which I think are great, to prompt staff with phrases that can be used when problem solving with students. In your procedures for addressing behavior errors, you want to include specific definitions that have contextually appropriate labels and names, represent a continuum of severity, and are comprehensive in scope. And then as you develop your procedures for addressing behavior errors, you want to include agreement regarding office versus staff responsibilities and options for addressing behavior with a continuum of consequences, which include the student's quick return to instructional activities and data decision rules for intervention and supports. Implement procedures by ensuring that all staff are included in developing these procedures and trained. And we want to regularly check for review of use and effectiveness. We want to look for a means of keeping track of the number of acknowledgements versus behavior referrals or other disciplinary infractions. And then having schedules and procedures for regularly reviewing and enhancing these. Procedures should be in place for identifying and supporting students whose behaviors are also not responsive. In order to effectively implement the procedures developed, you'll need to think about how and when to train staff in these procedures, think about how to ensure consistent use by staff, and schedule those regular reviews for effectiveness. This all relates to how you'll track and progress monitor behavior referrals, which we'll address in part 3 of responding to behavioral errors, developing and using referral forms. Your activity for this month is to develop a discipline ladder or flow chart organized by majors and minors and submit this document to Canvas. Make sure you work with your team to determine how you'll get input from other stakeholders and trained staff. If you would like to know more about this topic, please explore these additional resources. Thanks for joining me to explore Getting Started step number 7, developing a flow chart. To summarize, your team tasks will include developing a discipline ladder or flow chart, submitting these documents to Canvas, and working with your team to determine how you'll get input from stakeholders and trained staff. If you have any questions or would like additional support, please reach out to your Massachusetts Academy trainers, and please be sure to check out part 3 on developing a behavior referral form to learn more about ensuring consistent documentation and tracking of behaviors. Thank you for engaging in this work.